Welcome, everybody, and thanks for coming to today's webinar, Wiring for Change, Updating Workflows in Publishing. This idea started in our workflow committee at BISG. The better part of half a year ago, we were having a conversation about the kind of programming that we wanted to see in 2023 and 2024. And one of the suggestions from Dave Cramer of Hachette Book Group was that we start to talk about, I think what he described as how everything fits together. The notion that, there are many systems, sometimes very specialized in nature. They need to be interconnected to deliver an effective workflow result. So the interplay of technology along with the process and the people in using them. Dave has some really direct experience that he's going to be sharing with us today in the work that he's done at Hachette. And I think we're really fortunate to have him. We've got some materials that we'll be referring to as we go through, but this is really set up as a conversation between the two of us to talk about both the work that he's been doing and the lessons that he takes away from it. So Dave, thank you very much for being here today.
Oh, my pleasure, Brian.
Maybe you could start by talking about your involvement with technology at Hachette. I mean, you've had a number of different types of roles in that capacity, but several things have been project driven. What are they and how do they inform your thinking about wiring for change?
I think my background was in production. I had worked for a compositor in Brattleboro, Vermont for many years and got involved especially in tools that create ebooks, which sort of led to my other career working on ebook standards. And so there was always this, if you start with a book file in Designer Quark, you have to turn that into something else, to make it an ebook. You have to turn it into XML or HTML. And so I think I started getting interested in, those connections. How do you move information from one system to another system? And then, we also, of course, have metadata that goes along with everything. And I've spent too many years of my life like typing book titles into ebook package files, which is not ideal, since those things are hard to proofread and you should never trust any single individual to type text. I think after...
Go ahead.
No, you go ahead, Brian.
I was going to say, I have it on good faith that all the hours that you put into retyping titles into other fields is going to be given back to you at the end of your life.
Oh, I am very happy to hear that. I can add several more years of things to my bucket list. I think then I got involved. Hachette did sort of a very long-term experiment with typesetting directly in HTML and producing both print and digital books from single source files. And we did start, addressing some of those programs. We actually built a tiny little integration with our title management system, so it would at least automatically populate the book title and author and publisher and pub date and ISBN, from our system of record. A concept will come back to this, to this interesting typesetting program. So I didn't have to type the title anymore. And so we sort of increased the quality of our information while reducing the labor that the people involved in production were doing. So it was one of those things where the automation made everything better.
And before we go into the lessons, because I'd love, we have about 8, I think, different things that you've taken away from the experiences you've had, particularly in the more recent projects. To what extent, in your view, has technology become a more important force in book publishing? And maybe the corollary to that is, how prepared are we as an industry to embrace its use?
I mean, I think the technology has always been there. It's like, melting lead to make type is pretty high tech and has its own hazards. It's just we've been shifting what kinds of tools we use. I remember at the typesetter I worked for, we we actually had a really good archival system, which involved, copying all the files onto CD-ROMs. We had a FileMaker database that sort of kept track of which jobs were on which CDs, but we just printed out that information and put it in a binder. So someone would just go look up the binder, find, oh, this job number is on CD 66, and you could get to it in a few minutes. And so we were, I think, appropriately using the technology available to us at the time. I'm not sure our systems today are that much more effective in certain ways. Certainly many more things are possible, but just those foundations of, how long does it take me to get you that old file? I'm not sure we're that much faster than we were 20 years ago.
We can go back to the DVDs in the wall, but the retrieval, I think, would still take some time.
Yeah, exactly.
So we pulled together a set of lessons, and the first of these actually is one that I guess we could have borrowed from Stephen Covey, which is to begin with the end in mind. The text is up on the screen, but how does the notion of kind of planning as a whole play out of the projects that you've been part of?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a really important one because, the project I've most recently involved with and have spent the last 3 years of my life on is Hachette Book Group replaced their DAM, their digital asset management system. We went from a very old end-of-life parable system, North Plains Telescope, to a very modern, high-performance, beautiful system built by a Primo. And so a lot of the context of this conversation is going to come from our experiences with that transition. But yeah, I mean, the goal, it's not, we knew we needed to replace the dam, but that wasn't the goal. The goal was to make the lives of our employees better and to more efficiently get our book covers out into the marketplace, because the dam is the source of truth for our book covers. Our departments upload the covers to the dam, and then that starts the series of integrations that result in those covers ending up on Amazon.com.
So I think if I had to apply it to your specific example, so the goal here is not to replace the dam, that's the focus on implementation, but really to improve maybe the amount of time and effort that staff have to put into either populating or retrieving information from the system.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, one of the big changes we made, by applying this new technology and building all these new integrations was that, we were able to switch from weekly distributions of covers to daily distributions of covers. So, it looks nice on PowerPoint to say we're doing things 7 times faster.
And when you have examples like that of functionality that you either want to improve or even maybe that you've never delivered before, how do you kind of pick up that information? Are you doing interviews or conversations with the departments all around the company?
Yeah, I think this whole process started with a listening tour by our digital archivist at the time, who just basically would go to every department in the company and say, complain to me, tell me what's wrong. It's like, what do you bitch about? I'm here to listen. And she was really good about that and just collected, sort of vast amounts of sort of, this, I mean, I guess it's anecdotal information, but it's the most important information. This was the lived experience of our employees who were trying to do their jobs.
Yeah, and so it's not necessarily the case that you have to create a brilliant technological plan, but really you have to start by listening to the needs of the organization and then trying to find the solutions that make sense within that.
Yeah, I mean, that was sort of the raw material that then all, the project team could start with, and that sort of gave us the starting point for okay, what do we have to do here? What is the most important metadata that we're going to need to build into this new system? That was sort of the start of the data model, how people search for information, how people search for files. Marketing wants an interior PDF. Sales needs the latest cover to send to an account. And so we started from those stories, which sort of drove that process of starting to build the requirements in the data model.
Great. One of the things that you said, and this is kind of the second lesson that we started to talk about, you I think half jokingly said to me, and when we were preparing, that if you didn't mention a single source of truth, then you really hadn't done a presentation yet. And it is axiomatic, but maybe you could talk a little bit about why it's so important. You hinted at it a few minutes ago.
Yeah, yeah, I think it's sort of come up several times. It's like, for us as a publisher, we have a title management system that has, that is the source of truth for the book title and the author and so on and so forth. And so, back in the days when I was making ebooks by hand, it's like I was typing that stuff again, and that was terrible because, the ebook wasn't the source of truth for that information. And so the whole wiring this stuff up part means, find what the single source of truth for that information is, and then populate it by some automatic, hopefully foolproof process so that that information is always correct and always up to date. And so on this dam project, I think that was the single biggest piece was, getting all that title information from its home and our title management system to the new dam.
Sure, and I think that the thing that's interesting there is that you still maintained and defended that single source, but then found ways to, in effect, wire
Yeah.
to link the use of that data with the systems that were best configured to deliver, in this case, a dam, to deliver the assets to either staff or their customers.
Yeah, and then the dam became the single source of truth for the cover image. That's where it starts. If we have a new version of it, we have to put that in the dam, and then it flows out to everywhere it goes, including our website, various internal portals, and out to the marketplace.
The one of the things that, and this is a little bit deeper in the weeds, we suggested, and this is one of the lessons I think we wanted to draw out today, that new workflows actually favor API calls over batch export, with the note that data changes over time, and in fact, all the time, and that batch exports are kind of a snapshot of a moment in time. How does that actually happen, though, when you're trying to figure out how to link systems? Because all of a sudden, the way that information is stored in one place is material to the way it's going to be picked up and used in another.
Yeah, I mean, this is kind of interesting because I think you need to think about what time scale is important. It's like if someone adds a new format to a particular work in our title management system, the dam doesn't need to know about that 3 milliseconds later. There's sort of a natural time scale to these things. And, I think we would have wasted a lot of effort if we were trying to, we're not doing micro trading of stock, high frequency trading of stocks or something like that. So we needed to figure out what sort of a rational time scale for this is. And, in quite a few cases, we are just pushing new data from, the upstream systems to the dam once a day because that's good enough.
Agreed. And are you're doing that in batch, or are you is it a mixture of solutions?
Yeah, I think it's a mixture of things. We have we have a data integration hub that's sort of, there's all the different systems that are the sources of truth for various different kinds of information, title information, sales information, so on and so forth. And they all feed in a sort of standardized format to this central hub, which then feeds that information out to the other systems that need it. And so, I think the databases there do sometimes generate just like a bunch of flat CSV files, which are then easily imported into the downstream system. So I think in some sense it is a batch process.
And you mentioned an instance of where you might be feeding covers on a daily rather than a weekly basis. Do you think that the industry has begun to speed up or is speeding up in terms of its expectations for things like updates and content changes?
Yeah, we were really struck by how this change instantly became the expectation. Within a few days of launching, someone would upload a cover at 5:59 p.m. and we would get an email at 8 in the morning saying, why wasn't it on Amazon yet? I think the other thing about speeding that up is it makes it so much easier to fix the inevitable errors. It's like, the wrong cover for something goes out, and it's really hard to tell senior management that the problem is going to exist until next Thursday or something like that. So
Right.
being able to fix mistakes more quickly is critical.
And part of your focus has really been to improve the workflows within Hachette to better serve both your staff and their customer needs. But part of the problem you allude to is a supply chain issue that BISG would be working on.
Mm-hmm.
For example, if you upload a new cover, it's even though you may be working on a daily basis, most retailers are probably not, and so you probably have to match their cycle. Some are more frequent than others, but nonetheless, it's not the case that just making it available at Hachette makes it necessarily available for visibility for consumers.
Yeah, and I think that's a problem I think you're well aware of, and the different frequencies, and then we also, some of the covers like go to an intermediary who then feeds them out to a second level, and we don't have any control over that process. And so we can see the fixes propagate quickly to some places and much more slowly to other places.
Yeah, and we are working on that. We'll be talking about it at our annual meeting in a few weeks on April 12th, about the continuing efforts to transform supply chain communication. But part of it depends upon the ability of publishers like Hachette to deliver the information in a timely way on an ongoing basis without breaking the bank. I think one of the things that we also kicked around was the need to really understand what's required when you're integrating systems. The observation was that every potential vendor will claim that they integrate with another platform more or less seamlessly. And so you have to ask questions about what's happening, how much of the integration would be unique to, in this case, Hachette's use of the system, and what compromises to data availability and integrity might be involved. Maybe give you a little bit of the war story on that. How you have to really dig, but also talk about the process that you used as you sorted through what various vendors and partners could do with you.
It's funny because when you were just talking about that, I was thinking back to my days of typesetting systems and how, I don't know how many different companies told us about their automated typesetting system. It's like you don't have to have people adjusting pages by hand. And as soon as you asked them the simplest question about what actually they were doing, the salespeople were never able to answer it because they didn't really have the automation that we wanted and needed. They just said something that sounded good, but they had, I think their standards for typography were much, much lower than what we needed.
Yeah, a similar story can be told about every vendor that promised round tripping, so that if you made a change in a source file, that it would automatically be reflected in a rendered file.
Right. Yeah.
So how do you tackle this? Because I mean, every one of these systems is complicated. It has its own um, architecture, and you're trying to figure out how to make it fit, and will it fit with what you have in place?
Yeah, I mean, I think like this was the case because, the primary integration I talked about was between our title management system and the dam itself. And, there wasn't some, plugin or connector that anyone was advertising that did that. So we knew that that was something that we would have to build, that our implementation partner would have to build. Um, we did experiment with some other, they said, oh, there's a plugin for InDesign that makes it really easy to move InDesign files, from Creative Cloud to the dam itself. And, we tried that and it was safe to say not a good experience for the user. There
Right.
were so many compromises in trying to shrink a digital asset management system into a little palette in InDesign that it was quickly clear that this was not going to be useful for anybody. Yeah, just trying things out. Someone says, "Oh, here's an integration, here's a plugin." Go look at it yourself, and you will learn a lot.
And I think I know you can't talk in detail about the cross section of vendors that you probably evaluated, but at some point you're probably looking at multiple vendors, multiple potential partners. What kind of approach do you take to truly understand what they're capable of?
Yeah, I think part of that was, you know, as you said on one of your previous, guiding principles about using APIs wherever possible, a lot of that was trying to get a handle on, you know, how how extensive the API coverage is for the product. Like, are there things that I can do in my dam that I can't do through an API? We sort of had to figure out in detail, okay, can we do this action through their APIs? Can we do that action through their APIs to make sure that it was going to be technically possible to build the integration we needed?
One of the things that I think also comes out of that is you have to make practical decisions about what you change and when. One thing, you can't do everything at once, and I think that that's while that seems axiomatic, um, that there is an adage. I first heard it used by Ken Brooks, who chairs our supply chain committee. But big bangs make big holes. If a project requires you to do things like replace core components, you have to protect the database, that single source of truth throughout. And then at some point, you have to be able to deliver training and support throughout, both during and throughout the rollout. How does that kind of work? How did that get done in your experience at Hachette?
I think we knew we had to sort of control the scope of the project or we wouldn't have succeeded. And so, we had the core business requirements of cover image distribution and the archival functions of the dam to store all the digital assets that we create as we make books. And so we knew that with a new system that it was going to be possible to expand the use to many more groups within the company, that we could do stuff with marketing, that we could start a logo library, that we could start working with, possibly with the audio division, something like that. But we were really focused, what's the smallest project we can do sort of to replace the core functionality. And then once we've done that, then we can think about expanding the use. So I think we just tried to control that initial scope, just what's the sort of minimum viable product here.
So maybe the corollary to this is, to be mindful of scope creep or to avoid it. That everybody who sees an opportunity could, put a bell or a whistle or a tchotchke on top of the current scope, and then say, but you could also solve this problem. And what's the conversation like internally, whether at the shed or more generally, to try and maintain that? Because I'm sure that part of the enthusiasm for doing something new is greater functionality for me, but at the same time you're saying, yeah, but not yet or not
Yeah.
on this project.
Yeah, I mean, that was honestly a constant battle that came up almost every day. That I think eternal vigilance was required. And also, I think this is a case where having senior management that sort of understands how big IT projects work and what can make them successful or what can make them fail is important, because it was good to have backup from up high. If someone says, oh, I need this, this, and this, and you have someone who can say, yes, those are great ideas, we'll do them after we launch.
Right. And we'll come back to this we have two other things we wanted to just highlight in the approach that you've been taking. Before I do that, I just want to remind folks, if you do have questions for Dave, we've left time at the end of this kind of formal conversation for him to answer any questions you may have about his own direct experience or his perspective on what might be applicable to your particular shop.
I think we'd also be happy to hear from some of our audience's perspective, what they've been through. So
exactly. Thank you for reminding me of that. I think that one of the things that we also wanted to talk about is the requirements for improved functionality, and that they're going to continue to evolve. I mean, I could tease you a little bit and say perhaps this is a measure of job security, that there's always something else to add. But it's also important to think of the finish line as an aspect of a starting line. What does that look like in practice? I mean, how do you take a big project, and it certainly sounds like the ones that you're describing are pretty big projects, and turn them into things that also are the starting point for continued growth and evolution?
I think part of that comes from what we just talked about, controlling the scope before launch, but that, we ended up with, we already had a backlog of things we knew we wanted to do, even before the launch. So we were sort of ready, and we made sure that we kept access to our integration partners to continue to work on, all these pieces, connecting all these systems, because, not only did we want to add more functionality, but we also then started to have this lived experience of the system being used full-time by the whole company, which also continues to bring up issues that need to be fixed. And so, right. I think we knew that, that the launch was just a milestone in a much longer project. And so we kept the project team together. We had the resources we needed to keep going after launch and to continue to improve the system, both things we knew about before, and as our users got experience with the system, we continued trying to listen to them. It's like, okay, how can we make this better? How can we continue to make your work easier now that we have this very capable new tool?
Yeah, and I imagine that as people then began to work with it, so you probably have beta groups or testing groups and a variety of folks internally while you're rolling it out. But once people start to get to it, then their own ideas about how it could be used and become more useful evolve as well.
Yeah, and it was also, an interesting check on our assumptions and stuff. We thought people would like this and hate that, and sometimes, people surprise us, of things they find easy or what they found difficult, or what they want further automation with.
I have relatively few within the book industry study group. We work with them on a much smaller scale, obviously, than the one that you do day to day. but I'm reminded of the work we did to replace our website and upgrade our association management system in the second half of 2022. And we got to the end of that process and launched a new website in December of that year. And there was so much of the momentum that was kind of geared to get into launch date, et cetera. After that, we're like, okay, we're done. And of course, you're not. Your website needs to continue to evolve. Your functionality needs to continue to evolve. So maintaining some focus on that has got to be both important and a challenge for any organization.
Yeah, I think it is hard because especially, leading up to launch is such a stressful time and everybody is working so many hours with such intensity, and then just getting everybody through the first few months as new bugs come in and as you're still training and as you're seeing how the system is being used and possibly abused. So, we burn a lot of energy through the process of launch. And so you somehow have to figure out how to get to a more sustainable pace while keeping that momentum and keeping that goal of sort of continuous improvement.
I'll have to borrow your advice on that outside of this webinar. One question I wanted to ask you before we go to our last takeaway, with respect to vendor upgrades, I mean, one of the challenges with any system installation is you buy it, it's version 2.2, for example, and then the next thing you know, there's a 2.7 and a 2.9 and a 3.1. And sometimes if you've heavily customized the particular installation, those upgrades become more complicated. What's the balance between here's something I need for that's going to get me the results I need inside my own operation versus I want to be able to continue to keep up with the technology that the vendor is providing.
I think this is part of the reason why we now have a policy of sort of using only SaaS solutions. There is not, we use the Aprimo product as is. There is, it's highly configurable, but there are no actual customizations within Aprimo's code base for us. And since our integrations are purely based on their API, Aprimo is able to continually update their product and has not broken any of our integrations. And so it's actually been quite seamless for us. We've already seen massively improved functionality from Aprimo just because of the evolution of their product, and we're able to take advantage of that. And so far, it's basically had no downside for us. Our integrations keep working, the product just gets better.
Yeah, and it's interesting that the same website vendor and association management software that I alluded to before, the one that we launched a year plus ago, has a similar commitment that they don't develop functionality for one client that they can't roll out to everybody. They do it for their own reasons, but it also is part of the thinking that you've just described. They want it to work on an ongoing basis for everybody.
But that has certainly been a point of contention internally because various groups have really strong opinions on how certain things should work. But we're in a position where we can't completely customize the product on every screen because it is SaaS. And so we basically have to push back on that. And I think that's a key dynamic in projects like this, that you have to be able to say, oh, that's a good idea, but if it's not going to work for most of the companies of the SaaS vendor, then it's probably not going to happen, and so make sure that you can do what you need to do with configurations and integrations, because you're not going to have a change to the core product.
Right, and configurations here are things that are user determined, but they're built into the system in some way.
Yeah, and
go ahead.
I think that was another key reason we chose this particular product, because the internal configuration was so powerful. We had a lot of latitude to, make it work for us within the confines of the core product.
So we have one more kind of takeaway, and you noted, I think, in our conversation that you can't test everything before launch. You'd like to, but you probably will miss something, and it's also a time-consuming and a costly approach. So some things might be wrong. I think there might be bugs, there might be performance and scaling issues. And your advice is to have a budget to do that, to plan for it from the outset. I imagine that planning that budget and building a consensus for it and making sure that it's built into the spending that you're going to have at the time of launch is something that starts well before the system is implemented.
I think the key thing we did right in this project is that we wired up that integration between the dam and our title management system. We had that integration running live for 9 months before the system itself went live. So every day we would see, if we acquire another publisher or if we do a huge metadata resend, what happens if we get 50,000 new updated records in a single day? And so we uncovered a lot of those scaling issues before launch and all those performance processes because we were we were testing in the real world. It was the literal production systems, the literal production data. It's just, it wasn't live yet on the Aprimo side. And I think that was key to having a successful launch, that we worked through most of those issues when we had time to fix them.
And when you rolled it out, I mean, I imagine that some people were seeing the interface for the first time. You probably have to put some money into making sure that people are fully supported, that they're in whatever new pathways that you're recommending that they follow have to be taught and adopted.
Yeah, I mean the whole training was an integral portion of the preparation for the launch, and the timing is interesting on that too, because it's sort of wasted if you're training too long before the launch, because people, they don't have any urgency about learning it and they forget what happened in the training session and so on and so forth. So actually there was that was some of the feedback we got on launch, that some of the people thought that some of the training happened too soon, even though we tried to do most of it in the last month before launch. Other people,
because they didn't necessarily have access to practice after that.
Yeah, exactly. And they just, and it's hard to make time for something that's theoretical until you actually have to do it as part of your job.
Agreed. And then, of course, the opposite could occur too, is that you provide training as soon as the system is up and running, and folks say, "But this is now it's interfering with my old workflow."
Yeah, exactly.
Why didn't you train me? So
yeah,
it's a balance.
Yeah, and
I'm gonna go ahead.
No, and it's like, half the people said there was too much training and half the people said there was too little. Some people said, oh, I didn't need training at all, so why did you waste my 30 minutes or my 90 minutes? It's like everybody's different in what they need. So, know that it's impossible to make everybody happy. But the system was intuitive enough that a lot of people just figured out what they needed to do just by trying it.
So I'm going to stop sharing for a few minutes. We have a summary slide that we can come back to, but I know we have some questions from the audience. So I'd like to turn to Brooke Horn, our operations manager, and hear what you've been seeing as David and I have been talking.
Yeah, thank you both so much for your time. The conversation's been really valuable for folks, and we do have a few questions in the chat. First off, from Kathy Felger, for Dave, is Hachette still using typesetting in-house with XHTML?
No, that program has sort of wound down due to management decisions. We felt it was really, it had all sorts of advantages for the kind of publishing we do, and it was really fast, and was really economical, but, it was felt that having a more standardized approach across the company so that, now basically everything is done in InDesign.
Great, thank you. From the same viewer, Kathy shared that I found that deviating from TMS out of the box functionality can sometimes come at a cost, especially with new releases. Is this something that you found to be equivalent to, or do you have a different perspective?
Yeah, I think I mentioned just the, given that all our integrations are through the APIs, and since the vendor is sort of committed, maintaining stable APIs is sort of a core value in programming. So we have not yet had any issues at all with that. So it's been quite successful from my perspective.
Are you using any content provenance tools such as ISCC or C2PA to protect your content, or do you monitor that content once published?
Not to my knowledge. This may be outside my area of expertise here. I think there are, various anti-piracy efforts going on, but I have no idea what they are, which is probably just as well.
Yeah, we did a webinar with Sebastian Poth and Lisa McCoy-Kelly about the ISCC earlier this year in January. And it was Sebastian it feels like it's a really good tool, but I don't know of any production uses at this time. So, Hachette also is at a price point that's a little bit different from some other publishers where, if it's educational content selling for hundreds of dollars or at least a high single figures, it's easier to justify than it might be in for a trade publisher.
That does remind me of, I think another principle is that, we just, we made a fairly conscious decision to trust the users of our DAM, and so we have a pretty flat permission structure. We could have made our own lives incredibly complicated if we tried to micromanage access to every different type of asset. But, ultimately, we've hired these people, we trust them, we have really good employees. And so, I think we made the implementation and the maintaining of the permissions and users and security groups so much easier. And I think, so far, I think that was a really wise decision. And I would be really cautious about trying to sort of micromanage the behavior of employees by locking down systems on a very granular level. Sometimes it's necessary for legal or financial reasons, but in our case, we didn't have to do that. And I think that's made our life infinitely easier.
Great. Thank you for sharing that. We have another question from George Logan asking, did the success of this project then get rolled out to other Hachette groups, even though they may not have the same title management systems?
I think because, the other pieces of Hachette are in other parts of the world, and, they do, in some cases, very different kinds of publishing with very different kinds of systems. So we've certainly been sharing our experiences and what we've learned with these projects without necessarily using the same technology.
And does this roll out to, for example, Little Brown in the US, or are each of these kind of on their own bottom?
Oh, everything that's Hachette Book Group in the US is together. One of the interesting aspects of this is, we recently acquired Workman Publishing, and they never had a DAM. And so, there's some, additional training and, just sort of setting expectations about how all this stuff works. But we've integrated all their cover image distribution, and we're still working on migrating all their backlist assets from, sort of their random shared drives they're living on and getting them into the DAM and, getting good access and good security for them.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you. From Pat Lacoste, Pat's wondering if Dave could talk about the information management component of the system. She's asking particularly from a typesetting and ebook management perspective, such as keeping records about corrected pages, such as the printer X, printing Y, production notes, etc. Prior to COVID, we were managing info like this through something like a medical chart for each product, and Pat's struggling to move to find digital systems that meets these needs.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to that question. It's like, I think we sort of have three different systems that are touching on some of those things. And one of them is the title management system itself, which, is sort of, keeps a lot of sort of workflow related information about, reprints and corrections and so on and so forth, and what's been done on a title and what stages it's in. We are also, in parallel with the DAM project, we're implementing, an actual workflow tool. This is, Adobe's Workfront. And so that is also in progress of sort of having, a little more support for the stage by stage production of assets before they become final and before they end up in the DAM at the end of their life cycle. We do, like collect all these reprint pages and the stuff, we have the facility to have, there's a notes field in the DAM, to put, if there's something weird about a particular asset, you can note that for other people. And we have sort of a fairly rich taxonomy to describe, the actual function of each asset. And we're also trying to be very clean about versioning, about layering, newer versions on top of older versions. So most people will only see the most recent version of the asset, but we don't really have detailed notes about, oh, we corrected this on page 17 kind of thing.
Are you directly integrating Adobe into the DAM?
I think that's something that will happen in the future, but not yet. I think one of those plugins is probably being developed right now.
Yeah,
Sure.
and you indicated that you tested functionality like that, and it doesn't always work to the level that you need it.
Yeah, so it will remain to be seen how well that works. And we have pretty efficient methods of getting content into the system. It's basically, use a specified file name and then it's drag and drop and walk away. And so there's also the question is, building a fancy, how much effort is building a fancy integration going to save? Right. The horrible phrase that has been going through the company is the juice worth the squeeze?
I'm not going to repeat that.
Please don't.
Brooke, it looks like Bill Kasdorf has his hand raised and he might have a more complicated question. Perhaps you could invite him to just phrase it directly.
Yeah, I'm not able to. Nope.
I think that will give him that ability. Bill, you may be able to join us directly.
Great, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
We can.
Hi, Bill.
Yeah. Hi, Dave. My question is maintaining, basically documentation, training, etc. when you've got a very complex system that's composed of very complex components. And so I'll give you an example from kind of the opposite end of the scale from Hachette, which is me, because I'm a single person, right? I'm just a guy. But two of the essential tools that I use are Microsoft Word and InDesign. Well, first of all, I subscribe to Office 365, so Word gets updated automatically all the time. And I subscribe to Creative Suite, and I can check a box and keep InDesign updated all the time. But there are now so many features in those programs that a lot of people just aren't aware of them. And I'll give you an example. I was working on something where I was basically creating a PDF from InDesign,
Mhm.
and it kept not creating, not including a couple of the pages in my InDesign in the PDF, and I couldn't figure out why it wasn't doing that. So I reached out to somebody else, which is Linda Secondari, because she's kind of my InDesign guru. She didn't even know how to do it. So she went on, a list that she was on, and it turned out to be a totally simple thing. But so many of these components have all the little intricate quirks to them. You see where I'm going, and why I couldn't just put that in the Q&A, because it's a convoluted issue, but that's the point.
Yeah. So,
So what is Hachette doing in that regard?
Yeah. So I think this is, this is training, documentation, and ongoing communication with our user community. So after we did the whole round of training before, during, and after launch, all of the trainings are also videotaped and available in a training library. We created training documentation from that lives on the company intranet and is also updated as needed. And then beyond that, if something changes significantly in the workflow, we can, we have email lists for all the different categories of users of this system, and then we have sort of, governance boards of the super users, and we can communicate with them as well and sort of disseminate information from, the core team to the super users to the end users. There hasn't been, but the rate of change hasn't been that high. The product is evolving, but, we don't use literally every feature of the product. And so far it hasn't been much of a problem, in the 7 or 8 months since we went live.
I think we do have one other person that would like to speak. So Leah Stearns, I'm going to add you and ask you to unmute.
Hi, I was just talking about managing output of the information, not so much managing the content itself, but managing output of the information about the information. Any tips for staying agile, for adapting to distribution partner specific deviations from standards?
Yeah, I don't know sort of the details of the architecture of how we do that. I have been involved in writing little custom snippets of code to like alter the Onyx a little bit for particular partners that have particular requirements. I think the capability to do that is sort of built into our title management system and its associated, Onyx creation and Onyx distribution functions. But, I know we do have a bunch of little, snippets of customization code there, which will, create the Onyx necessary for a particular partner. But
Dave and I are not, we haven't discussed this in any depth, but the Transforming Supply Chain Communications Initiative, that's one of the sort of flavors of Onyx, as an example of this disconnect, is one of the things that we're trying to tackle directly in it. Leah, if you're interested, we'd love to have you kind of join that ongoing conversation.
Definitely interested. Thank you.
Great. Brooke, you probably want to just touch briefly on Phil Madden's observations. Phil, for folks who may not know, is a colleague of Dave's at Hachette, and has a couple of observations, Brooke, on what makes for effective documentation.
Phil Madden shared, keeping reigning documentation up to date on a system that is constantly being tweaked and updated is horror and requires a lot of time and resources. And I think that's something that we can all agree with. Secondly, he added, having people who can be used as training resources is much more effective. You don't learn a system by reading training materials. You learn the system by using the system. Having human support for that is essential.
And you have to close with Edson's question for Dave.
It's a workflow document in your background.
What is behind me is the graphic score for a musical piece I heard played at the Vancouver Jazz Festival in 1993. It was created by a British avant-garde bass player and composer who used to be an architectural draftsman, and he took a painting by the Scottish painter Alan Davey, took all these symbolic elements in the painting, put them on flashcards, and used them to sort of create an improvised piece by signaling the members of the ensemble with both some of the written materials you see here and graphics from the painting. And the final score was such an interesting visual piece that they ended up doing a limited edition print.
Well, that's absolutely.
I can't think of a better way to close. Dave, you've given us a lot to think about. The materials that we use today to kind of guide our conversation will be distributed with the recording of this webinar shortly, and it'll be made available to everybody who's registered. Thank you so much for doing this and for kind of setting the stage, not just for our thinking about how to integrate systems in an era where technology is very important to the work that we do, but also the walk up to some of the things we're going to be talking about next month at our annual meeting.